This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
Good morning, Dan, and in for Amy this morning, Kristen McQuarrie of the Chicago Trib Ed Board. And Kristen, do you think voter fraud and what you hear from your colleagues in the hallowed halls at Trib Tower, is that a real thing, or is that a real thing to be concerned about? Does it actually happen, or is this just a fiction of the right wing?
I would say I hear more often that it is a fiction of the right wing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the Heritage Foundation has a database documenting actual cases. And on Thursday, they released a new edition of its voter fraud database featuring 100 new cases. The database now documents 1,071 instances of voter fraud spanning 47 states, including 938 criminal convictions. So, 938 criminal convictions. Let me say that one more time, just because people have actually been convicted of voter fraud, like just a month or so ago, a former James Madison University student pled guilty to a charge stemming from his false submission of voter registration forms during the 2016 election. So those things actually do happen, which is why it's interesting that the left, who is so concerned, the left is so concerned about meddling by foreign governments in our elections, and that's certainly a legitimate concern. I'm concerned about that too, and it should be investigated, as it is being. Why aren't they concerned about domestic voter fraud and instances of that, and coordinated efforts like Bob Creamer, the convicted felon husband, Creamy Bob, of Calamity Jan Spakovsky, the effort that they were trying to commit voter fraud in Wisconsin, driving people up to Wisconsin to register them, that was caught on James O'Keefe undercover videos. I don't understand why you're concerned about fraud on the one hand, but not on the other. You're concerned about fraud based on the perpetrator or alleged perpetrator, not based on the behavior. It's weird to me. I don't know if we're going to get anywhere with our next guest, because he has already been dubbed one of the four horsemen of voter suppression.
Wow. By whom does he owe that distinction?
The kind of the left in general. I don't know. I mean, probably their 2020 presidential nominee, Maxine Waters. I assume that she would go along with this characterization. But along with Chris Kobach, J. Christian Adams, Ken Blackwell, our next guest, Hans von Spakovsky, who is a senior legal fellow for the Heritage Foundation, former FEC commissioner, Federal Election Commission commissioner, and a former lawyer at the Department of Justice, now mainly referred to as one of the four horsemen of voter suppression. Hans, thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Well, thanks for having me on.
Congratulations on the recent the recent title edition, one of the four horsemen. Why are you trying to suppress votes?
You know, the reaction like that is so bizarre. It's really hard to understand. Apparently, I've earned that title because I actually write about real voter fraud cases. So apparently, bringing the attention of the public to cases like we do in our database makes you a vote suppressor, and also because I've actually have written in support of voter ID laws, and I've committed the great crime of actually looking at the data. I've written numerous papers where I've taken turnout data in states that put in voter ID laws and looked at, well, what was the turnout like before the ID law? What was the turnout like after the ID law? And my papers and the data show that this claim that voter ID keeps people out of the polls is totally untrue. In fact, the states that have put these ID laws in, their turnout has gone up.
Mm-hmm. Tell us just more broadly speaking about the first meeting of the task force and what you see in the next, let's just say, 6 months unfolding from this body.
Sure. We had the first meeting on Wednesday. There are a dozen members, and it's a bipartisan commission. I mean, there are both Republicans and Democrats on it, and what we are setting out to do is to take a look really at the entire American election process from voter registration to people voting on Election Day to the counting of ballots. And what we're looking for are what are the vulnerabilities in the system. And so, for example, the Commission's already asked for the states to send the Commission their voter registration lists. The intent of that is so that we can compare those lists and see how many people are registered in more than one state, how many people are there who are dead, who are still on the list, and we know that's a problem. There was a comparison done in 2016 that showed, for example, that Illinois has close to 500,000 voters, 454,000, who are not only registered in Illinois to vote, but are also registered in other states.
Well, they don't live in Illinois anymore. That's why they're registered
They're
in other
fleeing,
states.
don't you know?
So, but they'd still like to participate.
Yeah, well, that could be, but in fact, that's part of why we've also asked for voter histories. A lot of that it may just be people who moved away, they neglected to cancel their registration, but how many of those individuals actually are voting in two states? We know that happens. We have cases like that in our database, and probably one of the most infamous cases like that was just a couple of years ago. A woman named Wendy Rose was running as a Democrat for Congress in Maryland, and the other candidates did some opposition research on her and discovered that she was registered to vote in both Maryland and Florida and had voted in both states in multiple elections. She was forced out of the race. She eventually pled guilty to voter fraud. But the point of that story is that election officials didn't discover that. It was only because she ran for Congress and people did opposition research on her that it was discovered. If she hadn't run for Congress, she probably could have gotten away with this and would never have been caught.
Let me ask you a question from the left's perspective. Maybe they would say, maybe some that are, willing to actually look at evidence would say, okay, sure, there are these instances, there are these one-off instances, but it's not a coordinated effort to rig an election the way that, say, the Russians have attempted to do or other outside foreign influences. And so we should really focus our time on those foreign influences. And yes, elections are imperfect things, but they're state and local things, and it varies widely from state and local election authority to state and local election authority. And so we're making too much of this, saying that there's kind of widespread, rampant fraud, coordinated, conspiratorial efforts to rig elections.
Well, what I would say to that is no one is saying that there's widespread, rampant fraud. What we're saying is that there's enough fraud out there that it should concern us. It's like saying, oh, well, the amount of bank fraud in the country is really just a small percentage of the amount of financial transactions that go on every day, so let's just not worry about it and let's not take any steps to stop it. And, yeah, some of the cases in our database are one-off cases. It's a non-citizen illegally registering and voting. But we have numerous other cases in which, in fact, it was a conspiracy. There were numerous people convicted, and the whole point of it was to change the outcome of the election, and we have cases where, in fact, it did change the outcome of an election.
So tell us about, you wrote, I think, or were quoted somewhere saying you thought it was odd that there was pushback from local officials in turning over voter information, a lot of which is public. But I find myself uncomfortable with the idea of sharing that information. It does vary county to county. In Illinois, how voter information is collected, and as conservatives, as it comes to like this Second Amendment issues and registering guns and database collection, people don't like to have their personal information shared with the federal government. So isn't that consistent with that position that you're seeing pushback?
No, and the reason is this. The Commission asked for publicly available information. And all of the states, including the states who have said, no, we don't want to provide this information, they routinely provide this information to anyone who walks in the door of the Secretaries of State's office. This voter registration and voter history information is provided to candidates, political parties, to commercial data companies, and every member of the public actually has a right under federal law to this information. So the states are basically saying, well, we don't want to provide this commission, which is only going to do research on this, with the same information they provide to everybody else, including the political parties. That's a very odd position to take.
I mean, I hear you. I think there's a difference, though, in a reporter or another candidate or someone going into a local office and collecting information, then turning it over to the federal government. And I know that's a fine line and probably maybe a nonsensical one, but you did see even conservative Republican secretaries of state in various states say no, that's not your job. If you want this information, go get it yourself.
Well, we are trying to get it from them, and like I said, they provide it. Look, we are going to safeguard it a lot more than, for example, the commercial companies that they sell it to. There are companies out there that the candidates use. Catalyst is one used by Democrats. Aristotle is another. They provide complete databases of registered voters from all over the country, their voter histories, and a lot more information, and the states routinely provide this to those companies. So, again, I don't really understand why anyone would have a concern with the commission having, again, what it asked for, which was publicly available information.
With respect to the Voter Fraud Commission, what is it that you hope comes out of the work of the commission, particularly because, as I said, elections are state and local matters?
Well, everyone should remember, again, it's an advisory commission. It has no executive power of any kind. The only thing we can do is make recommendations at the end to the states, to Congress, to the president on the steps that we think can and should be taken to fix some of these vulnerabilities. I'll give you another example of that. I've got 3 cases, court decisions, sitting on my desk from the 7th Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals. Each case is identical. Non-citizens who moved to Illinois, went and got a driver's license, registered to vote, voted in elections illegally. None of them were caught by election officials in Illinois. The only reason they were caught was because they applied for a change of status with the Department of Homeland Security. One lady, for example, wanted to become a citizen, and when DHS investigated, they discovered these people had illegally registered and voted. That points out a big vulnerability in Illinois' system that's shared by other states. They do nothing to verify citizenship, and we know non-citizens are registering and voting all over the country.
That's a real thing, and 938 criminal convictions documented in the Heritage Foundation's database. Those are real things, too. Hans von Spakovsky, Senior Legal Fellow for the Heritage Foundation, former Federal Election Commissioner, and former lawyer for DOJ as well. Hans, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate it.
Sure, thanks, and happy Friday.
Same to you. And he joined us on the Turnkey.Pro answer line.
The more you